Good evening, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Some crimes are so disturbing, they don't just make headlines, they make it to the big screen. But what we see in films is often only part of the story. And tonight, we're going a little deeper. This is Real Crimes Behind the Movies, where we take a closer look at the real cases that inspired some of the most disturbing films and uncover what actually happened. And for tonight's episode, you might notice something a little different. There will be a soft rain ambience playing throughout the story, and for an hour after the video ends. So if you drift off to sleep, you can just stay right where you are. So as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy true crime in the dark. And before you settle off, let me know where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing just how far these stories reach. Most of us have experienced bullying at some point in our lives. Whether it's in school, growing up, or even as adults, we understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end of it. But what happens when that dynamic doesn't just stay as bullying? What happens when it becomes something deeper, more controlling, more violent? And where is the line between being pushed too far and making a choice that can never be undone? Well, this is the story of Bobby Kent, a 20-year-old man who was killed by a group of young people who claimed they had finally had enough. They said they were being controlled. They said they were being hurt. They said they were scared, but others would later question that completely. This case would go on to inspire the film Bully, and while the story itself almost sounds unbelievable, it is very real. Bobby Kent lived in Hollywood, Florida, a place better known for beaches and tourism than violence. He came from a financially stable family. His parents had immigrated to the United States from Iran before he was born, and by most accounts, Bobby grew up with opportunities. He wasn't a standout student, but he was motivated. He had plans for his future, business ideas, and an interest in building something for himself. He was also known for his appearance. Bobby spent a lot of time at the gym, working on his physique, and to many people around him, he came across as confident, charismatic, even popular, but that wasn't the full picture. At the center of Bobby's life was his best friend, Marty Puccio. The two had known each other for over a decade and were almost inseparable. If one of them was around, the other usually wasn't far behind. On the surface, it looked like a close friendship, but behind that, things were far more complicated. Over time, there were repeated allegations that Bobby was physically aggressive toward Marty. Fights between them weren't uncommon, and according to those who knew them, these weren't minor disagreements. Marty would sometimes return home with visible injuries, bruises, cuts, and there were claims that he would beg Bobby to stop during these altercations. There were also incidents that others described as deeply unsettling. Bobby owned a Doberman that was known to be aggressive toward Marty. According to accounts, Marty would try to avoid the dog, but Bobby would force interaction, leading to repeated attacks that left Marty with bites all over his body, while Bobby would just laugh as he watched on. Despite this, the friendship didn't end. At one point, Marty did try to distance himself. He asked his parents to move away so he could get away from Bobby. When that didn't happen, he temporarily moved to New York to stay with relatives. But eventually, he came back, and when he did, the same pattern reportedly resumed. Some have since described their relationship as intensely toxic, the kind of bond where distance feels impossible, even when staying comes at a cost. That dynamic extended into other areas of their lives too. The two regularly went to a local strip club where male dancers performed, and it's been reported that Bobby forced Marty into dancing there for money. When Marty tried to stop, there were claims that Bobby was blackmailing him, threatening to expose him to humiliate him socially, which kept him from walking away. He threatened to tell his friends and family that he was gay, so Marty continued performing and handing over a portion of what he earned. But again, not everyone saw Bobby the same way. To others, he was driven, outgoing, and focused on building a future. After finishing school, he enrolled in community college and spoke about starting a business. He had ambition, confidence, and a strong presence. There were also reports that his behavior could shift dramatically. Some people described him as having two sides, one that was charming and sociable, and another that could be aggressive and unpredictable. There were allegations of steroid use, which some believed contributed to mood swings and bursts of anger, particularly in the gym where he spent much of his time. There were further incidents that raised concerns. In one case, Bobby and Marty became involved in creating pornographic video content, persuading another individual to participate. When that person later refused to continue because of the low amateur porn video, Bobby and Marty both beat him. There were also accounts of the pair targeting others together, including vulnerable individuals, behavior that suggested this dynamic wasn't one-sided. And that's an important part of this case. Because while Marty has been described as someone who was controlled and mistreated, some accounts place him as an active participant in harmful behavior alongside Bobby, which makes the situation far more complex. By this point, tensions were already building, not just between Bobby and Marty, but within the wider group around them. And one of the people who saw that most clearly was Marty's girlfriend, Lisa Connolly. She strongly disliked Bobby. She believed he had a negative and dangerous influence over Marty, and she pushed him repeatedly to cut ties and walk away. But leaving wasn't simple, because this wasn't just a friendship anymore. It was something far more entangled. And as frustration grew, so did the conversations that would eventually lead to a decision that would change everything. As tensions around Bobby continued to grow, the situation began to pull more people in. Marty's girlfriend, Lisa Connolly, had long believed that Bobby was a dangerous influence over him. She wanted that connection to end, and she wasn't alone in feeling that way. At one point, she attempted to shift things by introducing Bobby to her 18-year-old friend, Allie Willis. The idea was simple. If Bobby had someone else to focus on, it might create distance between him and Marty. But that didn't happen. The relationship between Bobby and Allie was short-lived, and after it ended, Allie made serious allegations about what had taken place during their time together. She claimed that Bobby had been physically violent, that he had threatened her, and that he had crossed boundaries in ways that left her genuinely afraid. She also alleged that those threats extended beyond her, to her child. Those claims began to spread, and within the group they started to shape how Bobby was seen. Conversations shifted. What had once been frustration turned into something darker. There were now discussions about how to stop him completely. According to accounts, Lisa became one of the central voices in those conversations. She was pregnant with Marty's child, and she wanted Bobby out of their lives for good. Around her were others who either shared similar experiences or believed the stories they had been told. Together, Lisa and Allie came up with an initial plan. The idea was to lure Bobby to a remote location and kill him there. Allie would bring him out. Lisa would be waiting. But when the moment came, Lisa backed out. The plan didn't end there. It evolved. They decided they would need more people, more certainty, more control. One by one, others were brought in. Allie's boyfriend, Donald Semenek, agreed to take part after hearing what she had told him. Lisa's cousin, Derek Duverco, and a friend, Heather Swallers, were also convinced to join, despite having little to no direct experience with Bobby themselves. And then there was Derek Kaufman. He presented himself as someone experienced, someone who knew how to handle situations like this. He spoke with confidence, claiming a background that made others believe he was capable of carrying it through. Whether those claims were true or not, in that moment, they were enough. What formed was a group of 7 people. Not all of them knew Bobby personally. Some only knew what they had been told. By July 14, 1993, the plan was set. They arranged to pick Bobby up that evening, under the pretense of spending time together. Allie told him they could go out, drive her new car, maybe even start things up again. To Bobby, it sounded like a normal night. He got into the car without hesitation. But inside those vehicles, things were already in motion. Weapons had been brought, hidden, prepared. They drove to a remote rock pit in western Broward County, an isolated area chosen specifically because it was out of sight. When they arrived, Allie led Bobby away from the others, down toward the water. They were talking, laughing, closing distance. To him, it likely felt like things were going somewhere. But behind him, someone else was approaching. What followed was sudden, and it escalated quickly. Bobby was attacked by multiple people, and as the situation unfolded, more joined in. He attempted to defend himself. At one point he turned toward Marty, someone he had known for years. But the attack continued. Investigators would later confirm that Bobby sustained numerous injuries during the assault, indicating that it was not a single act, but a prolonged and coordinated attack involving several individuals. Even as he tried to move away, there was no way out. Eventually, Bobby Kent died at the scene. Afterwards, the group attempted to cover what had happened. Weapons were thrown into the water, and they left the area together, later agreeing on a story that would place them somewhere else that night. That evening, Bobby didn't return home. His parents became concerned and began trying to contact him. Like many others, they turned to Marty. He told them he didn't know where Bobby was, that he had gone out and hadn't come back. But that wasn't the truth, because Bobby had been left behind, and secrets like that don't stay buried for long. Within days, the pressure began to build. Police were asking questions, and within a group of 7 people, the story was already starting to break, and it didn't take long for the truth to begin unraveling. The first person to speak was Lisa Connolly. At the time, she was heavily pregnant, and she confided in her mother about what had happened. During that conversation, she made serious allegations about Bobby, claiming he had assaulted her and that she had been living in fear of him. Her mother was alarmed by what she heard and contacted other family members, including Derek Duverco's mother. From there, everything began to fall apart. Derek also came forward. He admitted that while he had not taken part in the actual killing, he had helped move Bobby's body after the attack. He later led police directly to the canal where Bobby had been left. When investigators arrived at the scene, the extent of the violence became clear. Bobby had been left there for several days. The area showed signs of a sustained and brutal attack, with evidence spread across the scene, indicating that this had not been a single act, but something that had escalated over time. His identity was confirmed using the wallet found in his pocket. The medical findings revealed multiple fatal injuries, including wounds to the chest and upper body, along with blunt force trauma. Investigators also confirmed that more than one weapon had been used, reinforcing the belief that multiple people had taken part in the attack. At that point, it was clear this could not have been carried out by just 1 or 2 individuals. Police began pressing for more names, and eventually, they got them. Lisa and Derek identified everyone involved. Marty Puccio, Ali Willis, Donald Semenek, Derek Kaufman, Heather Swallers, a total of 7 people connected to the killing. Each of them would be charged and tried separately, based on their role. Marty Puccio, Bobby's closest friend, was charged with first-degree murder. He was initially sentenced to death by electrocution, but that sentence was later overturned and reduced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Lisa Connolly, who had played a key role in the planning, was originally sentenced to life without parole. However, that sentence was later reduced to 22 years. She gave birth while in prison and was ultimately released in 2004 after serving 9 years. Ali Willis was convicted of second-degree murder and initially sentenced to 40 years. That sentence was later reduced to 17 years, and she was released after serving a portion of that time. Since then, she has had further legal issues, including theft and parole violations, and has largely stayed out of the public eye. At one point, she even appeared on television, openly discussing her involvement in the case.
Alice is a stay-at-home mother of 4, struggling with the decision to reveal a shocking secret to her friend Shannon. She fears that revealing this will end their friendship, and she's also set this up to help you understand that if this does end the friendship, it would be very shattering to her.
Okay.
So, are you prepared to hear what she has to say?
Yes.
You prepared to say it?
Yes.
Okay. Alex, you're on.
When I was in high school, I was friends with several people. I had a boyfriend that abused me extremely bad. Well, there was supposed to be a fight and he was supposed to get beat up. He ultimately got murdered right in front of me. Everybody went to prison. I went for 8 years on a 40-year prison sentence.
Okay. Did you have anything to do with him
It-
being murdered, or it was just because you were there?
The majority because I was there to watch a fight and it turned into a murder.
Let's be a little clearer, Alice.
Because of the abuse I had suffered from him.
Physically?
Yes.
Okay.
The boys were supposed to beat him up, and it turned into more than just beating him
Did you
up.
hire the boys to
No.
have them beat
One
up?
was his best friend of 15 years. There was actually more to that I didn't even know have happened between the two of them until after I was arrested to why they did what they did.
But
That ultimately had nothing to do with me, that part.
There are two parts I think that are important, though. You helped get him to that location.
Yes.
Let's be fair.
Yes.
You got him there.
Yes, I've always taken that
People would
responsibility.
say you lured him there.
I've always been there, yes.
And then once it happened, then she was threatened with her life if she were to say anything to anybody. And you
Oh,
should also own the piece where you were the one that did speak up.
Yes, I did. I'm
Yeah.
the one that went to the police and
Oh, after he was
basically got
murdered?
the whole investigation rolling.
After he was murdered?
So it's
Yes.
messy, complicated, and with the trauma history and all, you kind of know how those things happen. Shannon, I see you struggling, trying to get your head around it. What are you feeling?
I feel that if it was, I was abused in high school physically from a boyfriend for a couple years, but I finally left and just got out. I don't understand why she would actually want people to come to beat him up. I would just have left, or I would have went to the police, got a restraining order, or I would have literally went across the United States to get away from him, Canada, I don't know. If you were that worried, or if they said they're going to kill, if you say anything, they're going to kill you, I would have left. Or before the action. After the action, I don't understand how somebody could just stand there and watch and not call 911 as you see a baseball come out. That would be my first reaction. Even though you probably hated him and you wanted him to die in your heart or your head, I can't understand why you would just sit there and...
Well, it was out in the wilderness. There was no cell phones at the time either. And it was at a wilderness lake area. It was totally undeveloped. And as far as the part for when it happened, I was in it because I had heard from my friend that her boyfriend was basically fed up with his bullying and abuse and the stuff that they were doing together, and he just couldn't take it anymore, so he was going to fight him. And I figured after what he put me through, I'd like to see him get his butt beat after being through it, so that's why I was there.
Was he still your boyfriend?
No.
Oh, so you had already broke up and
Yes,
you knew, okay.
we had already broken up.
Okay. No, I did not expect you to say that. But I still stand by you.
Donald Semenek received a life sentence, along with an additional sentence for conspiracy, and remains in prison. Derek Kaufman, who had positioned himself as the one with experience, was also sentenced to life in prison, along with additional time for conspiracy. Derek Duverco, who cooperated with authorities, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a reduced sentence. He was released after serving several years. Heather Swallers, who had a more limited role, also pleaded guilty and received a shorter sentence. Today, some of those involved remain behind bars. Others have gone on to live their lives outside of prison. For Bobby's family, the outcome brought accountability, but not closure. His parents accepted the sentences handed down by the courts. But his sister, Layla, was far more outspoken. She expressed anger and frustration that some of those involved were able to rebuild their lives after taking someone else's. And even now, this case continues to divide opinion. Some believe that those involved were influenced by years of alleged behavior, that fear, control, and repeated incidents pushed them toward a breaking point. Others believe that no matter what was claimed or experienced, there were other choices. Because in the end, this was not one person acting alone. It was a group that made a decision. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Bobby Kent was 20 years old, and this case still leaves people asking the same question. Where does explanation end and responsibility begin? I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you think the bullying was justified, or what could they have done differently? Let me know in the comments below. Hey there, just a quick interruption to truly thank everyone who has liked this video and others, as it really helps me out a lot. If you like true crime stories told in the dark, please think about subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Now let's get back to the video. This case takes us to Orinda, California. An affluent, quiet community where families felt safe, where success was expected, and where nothing like this was supposed to happen. It's June 1984, and inside the Costas family home, the phone rings at around 10 p.m. Kirsten's mother, Barrett Costas, answers. On the other end of the line is a young female voice, polite and composed, explaining that she's calling to arrange a surprise initiation dinner for her 15-year-old daughter, Kirsten Costas. Kirsten had recently been invited to join an exclusive social group at Miramonte High School known as the Bobolinks, or the Bobbies, a charity-based organization that, in reality, also carried a strong sense of status and social hierarchy. To Barrett, the call didn't seem unusual. She took down the details, agreed on a time, and assumed it was simply part of her daughter's growing social life. But before she could ask who was calling, the line went dead. No name was given, no confirmation, just a plan and a voice. At the time, Kirsten wasn't even home. She was away at cheer camp, focused on training and preparing for tryouts. As her mother went about her evening, excited for what felt like a new chapter in her daughter's life, she had no way of knowing that the person on the other end of that phone had no intention of taking Kirsten to any dinner at all. In less than 40 hours, Kirsten Costas would be dead. Kirsten Marina Costas was born on July 23, 1968, in Oakland, California. She was the first child of Arthur and Barrett Costas, later joined by her younger brother Peter. Her family was well established, financially comfortable, and deeply rooted in their community. Her father worked for 3M, while her mother dedicated much of her time to charitable work. They lived well, wanted for nothing, and eventually made the decision to move to Orinda, a place known for its strong schools, high graduation rates, and reputation as a haven for middle to upper class families. The Costas family fit in easily, and in many ways, Kirsten did too. She stood out, not just because of her looks, with dark hair, olive skin, and striking features that contrasted with the stereotypical California image, but because of her personality. She was energetic, witty, and full of life. At home, her parents described her as constantly moving, dancing from room to room, talking endlessly on the phone with friends, bringing a kind of energy that filled the house. Where her parents were more reserved, Kirsten was expressive, confident, and social. At school, she was part of the popular crowd. She was on the swim team, training to become a cheerleader, and moving within what many described as the top tier of her class. To some, she came across as confident and charismatic. To others, that confidence sometimes crossed a line, because not everyone experienced Kirsten in the same way. Some friends described her as funny and sharp, someone who didn't always think before she spoke, but never meant real harm. Others felt she could be dismissive, even cutting at times, particularly toward those outside her immediate circle. Among those who didn't get along with her were Nancy Kane and her friend Joanna, two girls who stood apart from the typical Miramonte image. Nancy had once been part of the more popular crowd, but over time her style and identity shifted. She leaned into a darker, more alternative look. Black clothing, layered jewelry, punk influences, something that made her stand out in a place where fitting in mattered. Joanna, on the other hand, came from a less affluent background and was often described as quieter, less confident, and noticeably different from the girls Kirsten spent time with. In a school environment where appearance and status carried weight, those differences didn't go unnoticed. There were tensions between them, comments exchanged, moments of friction, the kind of interactions that can be brushed off as typical teenage behavior, or remembered very differently depending on who you ask. Nancy, at one point, even made a threat during an argument, something that would later come back into focus, but at the time, it was just another moment in an already strained dynamic. Even within Kirsten's own circle, opinions about her weren't completely consistent. Some insisted she was kind and misunderstood, someone whose humor didn't always land the way she intended. Others admitted she could be harsh, especially toward people she didn't consider part of her world. And there were moments that reflected that side of her personality. At a sleepover hosted by one of her friends, a girl who wasn't part of the group had been invited along. She kept to herself for most of the evening, writing in her journal, while the others socialized. At some point, curiosity got the better of them. While the girl was out of the room, Kirsten found the journal and began reading parts of it aloud, sharing the girl's private thoughts with the group. Later, subtle comments were made throughout the night, enough for the girl to realize that what she had written had not stayed private. Moments like that, to some, were just part of being a teenager. To others, they meant something more. Regardless of how she was perceived, one thing was clear: Kirsten was driven. She was determined in her friendships, her social life, and her extracurricular activities. When she auditioned for the cheerleading squad, it wasn't taken lightly. The process was competitive, with judges overseeing the selection, and even families required to commit financially if their daughters made the team. It wasn't just about school spirit, it was about image, dedication, and belonging. And when Kirsten was selected, it reinforced everything about the life she was building. From the outside, it looked like she had everything. But in a place where social standing mattered so much, there were always people watching from the outside, comparing, measuring, wanting more. And for someone in that position, those feelings don't always stay quiet. When Kirsten returned home from cheer camp, she was riding a high. Not only had she secured a place on the cheerleading squad, something only 4 girls achieved that year, but she also had something else to look forward to. Something that felt just as important. The phone call. The invitation to a secret initiation dinner for the Bobbies. To Kirsten, this wasn't just another event. It felt like confirmation that she truly belonged in that world she had been working her way into. On the evening of June 23, 1984, she began getting ready. She went through outfit after outfit, carefully choosing what to wear, wanting everything to be just right. This wasn't just a night out. This was her introduction into something exclusive. Earlier that evening, her parents and younger brother had left for a potluck dinner. And at around 8:20 p.m., her mother Barrett called home one last time, reminding Kirsten to leave the porch light on so they could see when they returned. She wished her a good night. And just like that, the normalcy of the evening continued. At around 8:30 p.m., Kirsten got into a yellow-orange Ford Pinto and left the house. What followed would unfold in less than an hour, but would change everything. Roughly 30 minutes later, Kirsten arrived at the home of Alex and Mary Jane Arnold, a family she didn't really know. She explained that she had been in a car with a friend, but something about the situation had made her uncomfortable. The friend, she said, had started acting strangely, and she just wanted to call home. The Arnolds let her in. She tried calling her parents, but there was no answer. Sensing that something wasn't quite right, Alex offered to drive her back home, and she agreed. As they walked outside, Alex noticed something that didn't sit well with him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw someone standing in the bushes nearby, watching. Then, as they pulled away in the car, he noticed the same yellow-orange Ford Pinto following closely behind them. When he asked Kirsten about it, she brushed it off, telling him it was just her friend and that everything was fine. She didn't seem frightened. If anything, she seemed calm, even chatting about cheer camp as they drove. When they arrived back at her house, the driveway was empty. Her parents weren't home yet. So Kirsten told Alex she would go next door to the neighbors and wait there instead. He watched her walk across the lawn, and then, in an instant, everything changed. A figure suddenly rushed toward her, fast, aggressive, uncontrolled. Alex saw the attacker's arm moving repeatedly, up and down, in what looked like a frenzied motion. At first, he thought it was a fight, maybe a punch, something sudden but not deadly. The attacker then turned and ran back toward the car, jumped into the Ford Pinto, and sped away. Alex immediately got into his own car and gave chase, but he didn't realize what had actually happened, because behind him, Kirsten had been left critically injured. She had been stabbed multiple times. Despite her injuries, she managed to get to her feet and make her way toward her neighbor's house, where she collapsed near the doorway, crying out that she had been stabbed and that she couldn't breathe. Her neighbor, Arthur Hillman, rushed out to help her and asked who had done this, but before she could answer, she lost consciousness in his arms. He attempted to revive her, desperately trying to keep her alive until help arrived. Meanwhile, Alex had lost sight of the car and turned back. When he returned to the house, emergency services were already there. and Kirsten was being rushed into an ambulance. When police spoke to him, he was able to give a clear description of what he had seen. He told them the attacker was a teenage girl, blonde, with a heavier build and stringy hair. And just like that, the direction of the investigation shifted. Because this wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone young, someone local, someone who knew her. At 11:02 p.m., Kirsten Costas was pronounced dead. She was just 15 years old. The community of Orinda struggled to process what had happened. This kind of crime didn't belong there, and people quickly began searching for explanations that made sense to them. Rumors spread. Some blamed outsiders. Others pointed toward fringe groups or drug-related violence. Anything that felt easier to accept than the possibility that someone within their own community could be responsible. But investigators focused on the evidence. They had a description, they had a vehicle, and they had Kirsten's social circle. Attention soon turned toward two girls, Nancy Kane and her friend Joanna, who were known to have had tension with Kirsten. However, both had solid alibis, and neither matched the physical description given by the witness. Despite this, suspicion lingered. Nancy, in particular, became the target of intense backlash, receiving anonymous phone calls and facing harassment at school, largely because she stood out from the crowd and didn't fit the typical image of the popular group. But police knew they were looking in the wrong place, so they brought in the FBI. Profilers analyzed the case, studying the nature of the attack and the relationships surrounding Kirsten. Their conclusion was clear. This had been a personal, emotionally driven crime, not planned in a calculated way, but carried out in a moment of overwhelming intensity. They believed the person responsible was someone within Kirsten's peer group, someone who felt overlooked, someone who felt like an outsider looking in, someone who believed in their own mind that what they had done was justified. And as that profile came together, it began to point toward one name, a girl who had spent years watching from the edge of that inner circle, wanting to be part of it more than anything else. Her name was Bernadette Prodi. Bernadette Prodi had always been close enough to see the world she wanted, but never quite close enough to be part of it. Through a friend from junior high, she had some access to Kirsten's social circle, and over time she would appear more frequently at gatherings and social events, often lingering on the edge of conversations, trying to find her way in. To some people, she came across as eager, but to others she seemed like someone trying just a little too hard to belong. Kirsten, in particular, was said to have never really taken to her. She believed Bernadette was more interested in the status of the group than in genuine friendships, and that perception created a quiet but important divide between them. The contrast between the two girls became more obvious over time. They had both auditioned for the cheerleading squad, but only Kirsten was selected. Bernadette later applied for the school newspaper and was turned down again. And in her mind, these weren't just ordinary disappointments. They became something much bigger. She began to believe that she wasn't pretty enough, not popular enough, and that no matter what she did, she would always fall short compared to girls like Kirsten. Despite being intelligent, capable, and having her own group of friends, she couldn't see her own value. Instead, she focused entirely on what she lacked, and what Kirsten seemed to have so effortlessly. Some moments seemed small to others, but stayed with Bernadette. On a school ski trip, she had worked hard to afford her place, taking on jobs around the neighborhood just to be able to go. But she didn't have the same clothes or equipment as the others. Comments were made about her appearance and her things, and while some people may have brushed those off as typical teenage behavior, Bernadette took them deeply personally. Over time, Kirsten stopped being just another student in her eyes, and instead became a symbol of everything she wanted to be, but felt she could never become. At the same time, Bernadette was getting closer to that world. She had gained access to the Bobbies through another connection, and she even worked alongside Kirsten at school, but even then, it still wasn't enough. No matter how close she got, she still felt like she was standing just outside, watching everyone else live the life she believed she deserved. Eventually, that feeling grew into resentment, and from there, into something much darker. In her mind, there were only two options left. Either she found a way to truly belong, or she removed the person she believed stood in the way. While Kirsten was away at cheer camp, Bernadette made a decision that would set everything in motion. Instead of calling from home, she walked to a payphone and contacted the Costas household, arranging the so-called initiation dinner. She didn't give her name and ended the call quickly, making sure she couldn't be easily identified. Days later, on June 23rd, she told her father she would be babysitting at a nearby house, somewhere she often went, and asked to keep the car so she could get home later. He agreed, unaware that she had no intention of going inside that house at all. Instead, Bernadette got into the yellow-orange Ford Pinto and drove to pick up Kirsten. From the moment Kirsten got into the car, something felt off. This wasn't what she had been expecting, and it wasn't who she had been expecting either. Bernadette explained that the dinner wasn't happening and suggested they go to a party instead, but nothing about the situation felt quite right. At one point, Kirsten noticed a large knife in the back of the car, which Bernadette quickly explained away, and somehow the moment passed. They eventually drove to a church parking lot, where the atmosphere shifted. What started as a conversation quickly became uncomfortable, as Bernadette began asking why Kirsten treated her the way she did, and why she couldn't just be her friend. The tone changed, and the situation became tense enough that Kirsten chose to get out of the car and walk away. For a brief moment, it seemed like that could have been the end of it, but it wasn't. As Kirsten made her way back toward home, Bernadette followed. Later, she would describe that moment as losing control, saying she saw red. What followed was a frenzied attack in which Kirsten was stabbed multiple times. Bernadette then returned to the car, drove home, cleaned the knife, put it back, changed her clothes, and later even went out for a walk with her mother, appearing calm and composed, with no outward sign of what had just happened. In the days that followed, suspicion moved through the community, but no one immediately focused on Bernadette. She didn't fit what people expected. She was known as polite, quiet, and well-behaved, and instead attention fell on others, including girls who had previously clashed with Kirsten. While they were being blamed and targeted, Bernadette remained in the background, saying nothing. That silence didn't last forever. As police continued their investigation, inconsistencies in her story began to appear. She agreed to a polygraph test, but some of her answers raised questions, particularly around her whereabouts that night. When her alibi began to fall apart, investigators brought her back in and laid everything out: the evidence, the profile, and the growing suspicion. She was close to confessing, but instead they gave her time to think. And that time led to the end of it. The following day, Bernadette wrote a letter to her mother, confessing to everything. Shortly after, on December 10th, 1984, she turned herself in and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Because she was only 15 at the time of the crime, the maximum sentence she could receive under California law was 10 years. For Kirsten's family, that outcome felt deeply unjust. They believed this had been planned, not a sudden loss of control, pointing to the phone call, the setup, and the choices made along the way. They pushed for the case to be recognized as first-degree murder, not to increase the sentence, but to reflect what they believed had truly happened. However, the court did not agree, and the original charge remained. Bernadette served a portion of her sentence and was released at the age of 23 with a new identity and a chance to build a new life. She went on to have a family, a career, and a future, something Kirsten Costas never had the opportunity to experience. Kirsten's family, unable to remain in the place where their daughter had been taken from them, eventually left Orinda behind. Years later, the case would resurface through a television film, one that many felt portrayed the events in a way that didn't reflect the reality of what had happened, particularly in how it depicted both Kirsten and Bernadette. That movie was called Death of a Cheerleader, but beyond the headlines, the portrayals, and the debates, the reality remains the same. Kirsten was just 15 years old, and her life ended on a night that began like any other. And so, I'll leave you with this. Do you believe this was a moment of sudden, overwhelming emotion, or do you think it was something far more deliberate, something that had been building long before that night? The film Alpha Dog introduced the world to a case that shocked America, a story of ego, control, and a decision that spiraled into something irreversible. But behind the characters and dramatization was a real boy, a real family, and a real loss. This is the true story of what happened to Nick Markowitz. It begins in the suburbs of West Hills, California, where 20-year-old Jesse James Hollywood was building a reputation. On the surface, he didn't stand out. He grew up in a comfortable, middle-class area, the kind of place where nothing this extreme is supposed to happen. As a teenager, he was known for being confident, charismatic, the kind of person who could talk his way out of almost anything. But as he got older, that charm began to take a different direction. Jesse became involved in drug dealing at a young age, and what started small didn't stay that way for long. By his late teens, he had built a network around him, surrounding himself with other young men who were drawn in by the lifestyle, the money, the freedom, and the illusion of power. Together, they created something that felt bigger than it was, and Jesse began to believe he was untouchable. His house became a hub. People came and went, parties blurred into business, and everything started to revolve around control. Control over money, over people, and over reputation. Because in Jesse's world, respect wasn't earned, it was enforced. But while Jesse's world was growing darker, Nick Markowitz's life couldn't have been more different. Nick was just 15 years old. He was the youngest in his family, raised in Los Angeles by parents who loved him deeply. He was easygoing, friendly, the kind of teenager who enjoyed being around people and made others feel comfortable without trying. He had his whole life ahead of him. But his older half-brother, Ben Markowitz, had crossed paths with Jesse, and that connection would change everything. Ben had become involved in Jesse's world and had built up a debt. To Jesse, it wasn't just about money. It was about principle, about control, about making an example. On August 6th, 2000, Nick was walking near his home, completely unaware that he was about to be pulled into something he had nothing to do with. He was taken, not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was connected to. What followed is one of the most unsettling parts of this case, because for days Nick was kept with Jesse's group, not hidden away in chains or locked rooms, but moving between houses, surrounded by people who knew something wasn't right. He was given alcohol. He watched movies. He tried to act normal, and at times it didn't even look like a kidnapping. But that illusion is exactly what made it so dangerous, because while it may not have looked like violence, the outcome had already been set in motion. Over the course of those days, multiple people saw Nick, spoke to him, spent time around him, and yet, no one stepped in. The line between what was happening and what people chose to believe was happening became dangerously blurred. And then, on August 12, 2000, Nick Markowitz was found dead near a remote hiking trail in the mountains. A life that had nothing to do with drugs, debt, or power ended because of it. The film Alpha Dog tells a version of this story, but what it can't fully capture is how quickly a situation like this can escalate, how a group of young people can convince themselves that what they're doing isn't as serious as it really is, and how one decision can change everything forever. The debt that sat at the center of all of this was never entirely clear. Some sources placed it at just a couple of $1,000s. Others claimed it was far higher, even tens of thousands. But the only person who ever really pushed the larger figure was Jesse himself. And over time, that number seemed to grow, not just because of money, but because of pride. When Jesse confronted Ben Markowitz about the debt, the situation escalated quickly. Ben argued back, claiming the drugs were poor quality, that they were causing problems for him, and that he had no intention of paying the money back. What followed wasn't just an argument. It turned into a fight, and afterwards things went even further. Ben and his friends caused damage at Jesse's house, pushing Jesse to increase the debt even more, claiming he was now owed far beyond the original amount. But at this point, it was no longer about money. It was about control. Because in Jesse's world, if someone walked away without paying, it didn't just cost you financially, it cost you respect. And that was something he wasn't willing to lose. So on August 6th, 2000, Jesse set a plan into motion. He took 2 members of his group and went looking for Ben. The intention was to take him, but what happened next came down to timing and chance. Ben wasn't there, but his younger brother Nick was nearby. Earlier that day, Nick had argued with his parents and left the house. He was heading toward his brother, unaware of what was already unfolding around him. And that's when Jesse and his group saw him. In that moment, the plan changed. Instead of Ben, they took Nick. He was grabbed in broad daylight and forced into a car. And what makes this even more unsettling is that people saw it happen. At least 2 witnesses were nearby. But no one reported it. At home, Nick's parents had no idea what had happened. At first, they assumed he was out with friends, that he would come back like he always did. But as time passed, that feeling began to shift. Something wasn't right. They had recently given Nick a pager, and his mother had made one thing very clear to him. If she called, he was to call back immediately. But this time, he didn't. In the early hours of the kidnapping, Nick was restrained. His hands were tied, his mouth taped, and Jesse made threats, describing in detail what would happen if the debt wasn't repaid. But then, something changed. Jesse left, and Nick was handed over to the others. What followed is one of the most disturbing aspects of this case, because instead of keeping him hidden, instead of treating it like a crime, they began to treat it like something else entirely. Nick was given alcohol, he was around people his own age, he was included in conversations, in games, in moments that, on the surface, didn't look like captivity at all. And slowly, his fear began to fade. But no one reported it. At home, Nick's parents had no idea what had happened. At first, they assumed he was out with friends, that he would come back like he always did. But as time passed, that feeling began to shift. Something wasn't right. They had recently given Nick a pager, and his mother had made one thing very clear to him. If she called, he was to call back immediately. But this time, he didn't. In the early hours of the kidnapping, Nick was restrained. His hands were tied, his mouth taped, and Jesse made threats, describing in detail what would happen if the debt wasn't repaid. But then, something changed. Jesse left, and Nick was handed over to the others. What followed is one of the most disturbing aspects of this case, because instead of keeping him hidden, instead of treating it like a crime, they began to treat it like something else entirely. Nick was given alcohol, he was around people his own age, he was included in conversations, in games, in moments that, on the surface, didn't look like captivity at all. And slowly, his fear began to fade. Over the next few days, they moved between different houses in Santa Barbara. More people saw him, more people interacted with him, and yet no one stepped in. Because to those on the outside, it didn't look like what it really was. Nick wasn't always tied up. He wasn't always being threatened. Most of the time, he was just there, watching films, playing video games, trying to make sense of what was happening around him. And somewhere along the way, he started to believe he would be okay. At one point, he even said something that would later stay with investigators, that this would be a story he could one day tell his grandchildren. But while Nick was beginning to feel safer, Jesse was beginning to panic, because he knew something the others didn't. He understood the consequences, and he knew this had already gone too far. Instead of speaking openly, instead of risking saying the wrong thing over the phone, Jesse went to someone he trusted, a lawyer, a family friend, because now, this wasn't just a situation he could control. It was something much bigger, and it was only getting worse. What was said between Jesse and the lawyer isn't fully known. But one thing is clear. He was told that kidnapping alone could carry a life sentence. At first, Jesse panicked. He left overwhelmed, trying to process what that meant for him. But that panic didn't lead him to do the right thing. Instead, it led him to make a decision. He returned to the group and began acting as though everything was fine. He reassured Nick, told him he would help him get home, promised to buy him a bus ticket, even give him money for the trouble. And slowly, Nick believed him. But behind that calm front, Jesse had already decided what needed to happen. Around a day and a half after the kidnapping, he contacted Ryan Hoyt, someone within the group who owed him money and was known to follow orders. They met. Jesse handed him a bag. Inside was a weapon. And then he gave him instructions to take care of the problem. It was said quietly, calmly, but everyone knew what it meant. A short time later, Nick was taken out to a remote area. At that point, whatever sense of safety he had felt was gone. He resisted, and in those final moments, the reality of what was happening finally caught up with him. Nick Markowitz was killed. He was buried in a shallow grave near a hiking trail, a place chosen quickly, without much thought. And it wouldn't take long before he was found. When his body was discovered, the truth began to unravel quickly. For his family, the news was devastating. His mother would later describe the moment as something she could barely process, caught between shock, grief, and disbelief that something like this had happened to her son. And then the silence broke. A girl who had met Nick during those days came forward after recognizing him from a newspaper article. She told investigators everything. She explained how people had seen him, spoken to him, and how at the time it hadn't felt as serious as it truly was. She even said she had offered him a way out, but Nick had believed he would be okay. And that belief had cost him his life. From there, the arrests came quickly. One by one, those involved were taken into custody. Ryan Hoyt was convicted. Others received lengthy sentences for their roles. But Jesse was gone. He had fled. For months, then years, Jesse James Hollywood remained one of the youngest fugitives on the FBI's most wanted list. There were rewards offered, public appeals, and growing pressure to find him. Eventually, investigators tracked him beyond the United States. With help from international authorities, he was located in Brazil, living under a different identity, trying to build a new life. But it wasn't just hiding. There was a plan behind it. Jesse had reportedly taken inspiration from the British train robber Ronnie Biggs, a fugitive who had avoided extradition by having a child in Brazil, exploiting a legal loophole at the time. And Jesse attempted to do the same. While in Brazil, he began a relationship and had a child, seemingly believing it would protect him from being sent back to the United States. But the law had changed, and the plan didn't work. In 2005, he was arrested, and later extradited back to the United States to face trial. The legal process that followed was long and complicated. His defense team fought hard, attempting to argue that Nick had not been forcibly held, that Jesse had not been present at the time of the killing, and that he had no direct involvement in the final act. But the prosecution told a different story, one of control, of influence, of a decision made and carried out by others. In July 2009, Jesse James Hollywood was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Years later, that sentence still stands. The film Alpha Dog brought attention to this case. It showed a version of events, but the reality is far more unsettling, because this wasn't a story about hardened criminals. It was a group of young people making decisions they didn't fully understand until it was too late. Nick Markowitz was just 15 years old, a teenager who should have had his whole life ahead of him. Instead, he became part of a story that should never have happened. Rest in peace, Nick Markowitz. This was truly a senseless crime in which a life was taken over ego. A boy that had nothing to do with that lifestyle lost his life over it. And that is where tonight's story ends. Real lives, real consequences, and a truth that's often far more unsettling than anything we see on screen. If you made it this far, thank you for being here with me tonight. And as always, if you enjoy these stories told in the dark, don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our little nighttime community. For now, I'll leave you with the sound of the rain, so you can unwind, switch off, and drift into sleep. Good night, and I'll see you in the next one.